this will help. See that pale golden light? It means rain tomorrow instead of tonight.
Teach me the sky sometime.
Teach me your grain reading sometime, and we'll call it a fair trade.
The stage from Miles City rattled into Sable Creek 2 hours behind schedule, and Cassia Truett spent the last of those 2 hours doing what she always did. When her mind had nowhere safe to land, she mended something. The hem of her traveling dress had come loose somewhere around the second river crossing, and she worked the needle through the wool with small, even stitches, the same rhythm her mother had taught her before she could properly read. It kept her hands busy. It kept the rest of her still. She was 25 years old, and she had been married for 3 weeks to a man she had spoken with for exactly 40 minutes in her whole life, on a platform in Kansas City where he had come through on cattle business, and she had come to hand-deliver a dress order that no longer had anyone left to collect it. Samuel Kincaid had needed a wife to satisfy the terms of a loan renewal his late father had signed. Cassia Truett had needed a reason to leave Kansas that did not involve walking past the burned lot where Truett and Daughter's dressmaking used to stand. They had married by a circuit preacher's letter and a signed license, and that had seemed at the time like the honest whole of it. She did not tell him about the fire in her letters. She told him she was a fine seamstress, capable with a ledger, unafraid of hard work, and all of that was true. She did not mention that her younger sister Naomi had died in the same fire that took the shop 3 nights before Christmas, or that Cassia had spent the year since convincing herself that anyone who stood too close to her eventually got burned too. Some things did not belong in a letter meant to secure a marriage of convenience. She had told herself that was practicality. It was underneath something closer to fear. The stage rolled to a stop in front of a mercantile with a hand-painted sign reading Corwin's, and Cassia stepped down into air that smelled of pine and river mud, instead of smoke, which she noted, the way she noted most things now carefully, as a fact rather than a comfort. Samuel Kincaid was waiting with the wagon hat in hand, looking like a man who had rehearsed several greetings and abandoned all of them. He was tall in the unhurried way of men who worked outdoors for a living, sun-marked at the collar, with hands that looked like they'd forgotten what gloves were for. He did not smile too wide or too eager. He simply looked at her the way you'd look at a fact you were glad to have confirmed. "Mrs. Kincaid," he said, and the name still sat strange on both of them. "Mr. Kincaid," she answered, and reached for her own trunk before he could take it from her, an old habit of carrying her own weight that she had no plans of breaking for a stranger husband, or not. He let her carry it 3 steps before he took the other handle without asking, so that they were carrying it together, which was, she would think much later, the first true thing he ever told her about himself. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour through grass gone gold at the edges, with the first hint of September, and Samuel talked the way she imagined a man talked when he'd spent a great deal of time alone with cattle, and not much time with people. Plainly a little too carefully, filling silences he seemed to feel obligated to fill. He told her about the herd, about the loan his father had taken out the year before he died, about a renewal clause that came due every autumn and required, among other things, a wife and a household to satisfy the bank's notion of a stable borrower. He did not dress it up as romance. Cassia appreciated that more than she let on. "I know this isn't the arrangement most women dream of," he said, eyes on the road, not on her. "I won't pretend otherwise. But I mean to treat you fair, and I mean to hold up my end, whatever that comes to look like." "I didn't come out here dreaming of anything, Mr. Kincaid," Cassia said. "I came out here to work. Dreaming is a luxury I gave up some time back." He glanced at her, then something passing behind his eyes that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite pity, and he had the good sense to offer neither. "Then we'll get along fine," he said. "I gave mine up around the time my father did. The ranch house came into view at the top of a low-rise sound-built and unremarkable with a barn that had clearly been kept in better repair than the house itself, the way a working man's priorities usually showed themselves. Cassia looked at it for a long moment before she said anything. "It'll do," she said, which was from her something close to approval. Samuel almost smiled at that. Almost. "That's the finest compliment I've gotten in a year," he said, and helped her down from the wagon with a hand that let go the moment her boots touched ground, careful not to hold on a second longer than she wanted. She noticed that. She filed it away, the same careful way she filed away everything uncertain, yet what to do with a man who seemed to understand, without being told, exactly how much space a person needed. She turned back once toward the wagon and the road. They'd come by the grass gone the color of a worn penny in the last of the light, and found to her own mild surprise that the land did not strike her as harsh, the way she'd braced herself for it to. It struck her as honest. There was nothing in it pretending to be softer than it was, and after a year of towns that had smiled at her with one face and turned another, the moment her back was to them, honest ground felt like something she could learn to stand on. "It's a fair piece of country," she said half to herself. "Took me leaving it once to learn that," Samuel said, following her gaze. "Went to Cheyenne for 2 years after my mother passed. Thought I wanted city work. Came back inside 18 months. Some ground just keeps calling a person back, whether they mean to answer or not." Cassia said nothing to that, but she thought walking up the porch steps behind him that she understood the shape of a thing that called you back even when you'd sworn you were done being called anywhere. The house smelled of wood smoke and saddle leather, and nothing at all like a home a woman had ever lived in, which did not surprise Cassia so much as confirm what she'd already guessed on the ride out. Samuel Kincaid had been keeping this house alone since his mother passed years before his father, and it showed in every corner, clean, functional, and entirely without softness. He showed her through it plainly, room by room, the way a man shows a hired hand, the lay of a property rather than the way a groom shows a bride her new life. The kitchen, the washroom, the room that would be hers at the end of the hall, with a door that closed and a lock that worked, which he pointed out without her having to ask. "Nobody comes through that door without you saying so," he said. "That's your room plain and whole. I sleep at the other end of the hall." She said thank you and meant it more than the 2 words could carry. It was in the corner of that room that she found the thing that undid some small, guarded piece of her composure. A cabinet freshly built pine, still pale and faintly sweet-smelling, with 3 narrow drawers, sized exactly for thread and needles and the small tools of a seamstress's trade. "I didn't know what all a dressmaker needs," Samuel said from the doorway, sounding almost apologetic about it. "Wrote to a shop in Miles City and asked. They said thread wants a dry, dark place, so I put it away from the window." Cassia ran her fingers along the top drawer's edge for longer than the moment strictly required. She had packed her whole trade into one traveling case, expecting to unpack it onto whatever bare surface was available, the way she'd done in 3 towns since the fire. Nobody had built her a place for it before asking. "You didn't need to do this," she said, which was true, and which was also, she realized as she said it, not quite the same as "I didn't want you to." "Didn't need to," Samuel agreed. "Wanted to know my wife had a proper place to work, whatever kind of marriage this turns out to be." He said it simply without asking anything back, and then found a reason to be needed out at the barn, the way she was coming to understand he did, whenever he'd said something true and didn't want to stand there waiting to see what she'd do with it. She did not cry. She had promised herself, standing in the ashes of the old shop a year before, that she was done crying over kindness she hadn't asked for, because kindness had a way of being taken from her right when she'd learned to lean on it. But she sat on the edge of the bed for a long while with her hand still resting on the cool pine of that top drawer, and something in her chest loosened by one careful degree, the way a knot gives when you stop pulling against it. That first night, long after the lamp was out, she lay listening to a house that made unfamiliar sounds, the settle of new wood wind, finding a gap somewhere near the eaves, a horse shifting in the barn beyond the yard. It was nothing like the sounds of the room, above the old shop where she'd once fallen asleep to the rhythm of her sister humming over a late order. And for a moment, the difference ached in a way she hadn't braced herself for. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum, an old habit from the year just past, and reminded herself the way she'd had to most nights since Kansas, that grief was allowed to travel with her without being allowed to run the whole house. Supper that first night was quiet, in a way that felt companionable rather than empty. Samuel had clearly cooked for himself for years and had no illusions about his own skill at it. A plain stew bread bought rather than baked coffee strong enough to stand a fork in. Cassia ate it without complaint and noted privately that she would be taking over the cooking within the week, not because he'd asked, but because her hands needed a task, and this house had one waiting. "There's a woman down the road, Temperance Loomis," Samuel said partway through the meal. "Widow sharp as a tack, minds everyone's business whether they want minded or not. She'll likely call on you inside a week, fair warning." "I've known women like that," Cassia said. "Generally, they're the first ones worth trusting, and the last ones worth crossing." "That's Temperance exact," Samuel said, and something like real warmth crossed his face for the first time that day. Later, after the dishes were done, and the lamp in her room was the last one lit in the house, Cassia unpacked her trade properly into the cabinet. He'd built her drawer by drawer, needle by needle, and found that the small, careful ritual of it felt less like exile in a stranger's house, and more for the first time in a year like beginning. Corwin's Mercantile, on a Saturday morning, was the closest thing Sable Creek had to a town square, and Cassia understood within 5 minutes of walking through its door that she was, whether she liked it or not, the most interesting piece of news the town had received in months. She bore the looks. The way she'd learned to bear looks, steady, unhurried, giving nothing away that a stranger could call an opening. She was there for thread and buttons and a length of good muslin, and she meant to get exactly that and nothing more complicated. It was at the counter mid-transaction that Adelaide Vane introduced herself, and Cassia understood inside the first exchanged sentence that this particular introduction had been planned rather than chanced upon. Adelaide was handsome in the deliberate way of a woman who had never once left her house without checking a mirror, dressed finer than the morning called for, with a smile that arrived a half-second too early to be entirely about pleasure. "You must be Mrs. Kincaid," Adelaide said in a voice pitched precisely to carry to the 3 other women browsing the dry goods. We'd all heard Samuel had finally settled his correspondence into an actual arrangement. "How was your journey out from Kansas, was it?" "Kansas," Cassia agreed. "Long but uneventful." "And the letters?" Adelaide said, still smiling, still pleasant, laying each word down like a card she'd already decided how to play. "How lovely that it all came together so quickly. My father always says a marriage built on paper correspondence is a marriage built on a great deal of trust. I do admire that kind of trust in a person." There was nothing in the sentence that a listening stranger could call unkind, and everything in it that Cassia recognized from a lifetime of reading rooms carefully as a first stone laid in a wall meant to be built higher later. "Trust generally works out fine," Cassia said, "so long as the people building the wall around it are honest about why they're building it." Something flickered behind Adelaide's composed face. Not quite surprise, more the small recalculation of a woman who'd expected an easier target. "Well," she said, recovering smoothly, "I do hope Samuel mentioned my father holds the note on the Kincaid place. Purely business, of course. Though I imagine a new wife ought to know the shape of the ground she's standing on." It was Samuel arriving at the counter at that exact moment, with a sack of feed over one shoulder, who answered before Cassia had to. "My wife knows the shape of the ground, fine Adelaide," he said, mild as ever, setting the feed down between them like a wall of his own. "Same as she knows a body doesn't generally announce a bank's private business in the middle of a dry goods counter. Your father teach you that, or did you work it out on your own?" Adelaide's smile thinned but held. "Just being neighborly, Samuel," she said. "You know how this town talks. Better it hears things plain from a friend than twisted from a stranger." She gathered her parcels with unhurried grace and left with a final look at Cassia that lingered a beat too long to be simple curiosity. Outside, walking to the wagon, Cassia kept her voice level. "She was your intended once, before me. It wasn't a question, and Samuel didn't treat it as one. Everyone assumed it years back," he said. "Her father assumed it hardest of all. It never got past assuming on my side of it. I mention it now so you're not caught flat if you hear the gossip second-hand and wrong." "I appreciate the plain telling," Cassia said, and meant it, filing away the shape of Adelaide Vane's smile, the same careful way she'd once learned to read a customer who intended to return a dress with a complaint invented after the fact. She did not yet know what use the shape of that smile would be. She only knew the way she knew a seam that had been cut wrong before it ever tore that it would matter later. Temperance Loomis called on her 2 days after, exactly as promised, and settled into the kitchen chair like a woman who intended to stay until she'd said her piece. "I heard about the counter business at Corwin's," she said without preamble. "Adelaide Vane's been sharpening that particular knife since before you ever answered Samuel's letter. Don't you go thinking any of it started with you or ends with you either unless you let it." "I don't scare easy, Mrs. Loomis," Cassia said. "Didn't figure you did," Temperance said, pouring her own coffee without being asked, which Cassia was coming to understand was simply how the woman operated. But scaring easy and getting worn down slow aren't the same trouble. One you can stand up to in a day. The other takes a body that's got somewhere solid to rest between fights. You've got this house now. Use it that way. It was, Cassia thought later, turning the advice over, the way she turned over most things given to her plainly, the first time since the fire that anyone had told her rest was a thing she was allowed to plan for rather than simply steal when no one was looking. The trouble found them on a Tuesday in the low pasture, past the creek, where a length of wire fencing had rusted through and given way sometime in the night. By the time Samuel found the gap, one yearling heifer had wandered into the bog beyond it and gotten her back, leg wedged between 2 half-sunk logs, and by the time Cassia arrived at a run with her skirts hiked and her sewing basket forgotten on the porch, the animal was in a state of pain and panic that had already put one of Samuel's ribs at risk from a badly aimed kick. "Get back," Samuel said, not unkindly, working to free the trapped leg without a second pair of capable hands to help hold the animal still. Cassia did not get back. "You need her still before you need her free," she said, and moved to the heifer's head instead of her legs, murmuring low, and even the way she'd once calmed a customer's spooked carriage horse outside the old shop when hand firm, and unhurried on the animal's neck until the wild rolling of its eye settled by degrees. Between the two of them, the leg came free within minutes, but the cut along the shin was deep enough to want closing, and there was no time to ride for the county's one veterinarian 8 miles off before the wound soured in the bog water. "I can close it," Cassia said, already thinking in stitches the way she thought about everything. "Clean needle-waxed thread, same as a hem that's torn past mending otherwise." Samuel looked at her for exactly 1 second longer than the situation strictly allowed. "Do it," he said. She worked fast and sure, the needle passing through hide instead of wool, her hands steady in a way that surprised no one more than herself because she had spent a year believing her steadiness had burned up along with everything else she'd once been certain of. The heifer stood for it, calmed by Cassia's low voice, and by the time the last stitch was tied off, Samuel was watching her with an expression she'd caught on him twice now, and still couldn't fully name, something between respect and recognition, as if he were rereading a letter and finding a line in it he'd missed the first time through. "Where does a dressmaker learn to stitch a leg like that?" he said, not quite a question. "Same place she learns to stitch anything," Cassia said, wiping her hands on her apron, breathing hard from something that wasn't only exertion. "You pay attention to what's torn, and you close it the way it wants. Closing, not the way you wish it would close on its own." They walked the heifer back to the herd together, in a silence that had changed shape since the morning, no longer the careful, polite quiet of two strangers sharing a house, but something with weight to it, unspoken and mutual. "I didn't marry a woman who could do that," Samuel said, finally looking straight ahead at the grass rather than at her, the way he seemed to do whenever a true thing wanted saying. "I married a stranger who wrote a fair letter and needed a way out of Kansas. I'm glad to find out there was considerably more to the bargain than I'd bargained for." Cassia felt the words land somewhere she hadn't opened to anyone in a long while, and she answered, careful the way she answered most things, now unwilling to hand over more than she trusted herself to survive losing. "Don't go expecting miracles, Mr. Kincaid," she said. "I closed a cut. I didn't work a wonder." "Didn't say wonder," Samuel said, and there for just a moment something close to a real smile. Said Barton, "There's a difference." Before they reached the house, he stopped her at the fence line and pointed west toward a bank of low cloud, gathering pale gold at its edges. "See that?" he said. "Underside catching light, like that means rain by morning, not tonight. My father taught me to read it off the color, same as you'd read a hem to see, was it cut on the grain or against it? Everybody's got a trade for reading what's coming. Yours is cloth. Mine's sky. Teach me the sky sometime," Cassia said, surprising herself with how easily the request came. "Teach me your grain reading sometime," Samuel answered, "and we'll call it a fair trade." She thought about that the rest of the walk home, turning it over the way she'd once turned over a bolt of cloth to check it for flaws before cutting, and found to her own quiet surprise that she couldn't locate a single one in what he'd said. The rumor arrived at church, which Cassia would later think was exactly where a rumor like that belonged, dressed respectably and delivered with a bowed head. Adelaide Vane rose during the after-service gathering on the chapel lawn, with a folded paper in her gloved hand. Her voice pitched with practiced regret rather than open malice, which made it worse rather than better. "I don't say this gladly," she began to a knot of townsfolk that had gathered the way townsfolk always gathered around the scent of something about to happen. "But I have a duty to speak plain when a friend's good name might be resting on false ground. I received a letter some months back before Mrs. Kincaid's arrival in a hand I now believe to be hers, addressed to my father's bank regarding an entirely different arrangement. The handwriting doesn't match what she's since signed on the license. It was a thin thread of a claim built from a coincidence of penmanship and Adelaide's own careful timing. But Cassia understood within the first sentence that thinness was never the point of a rumor like this. The point was the doubt it planted, and doubt did not need to be strong to take root in dry ground. Cassia stood very still through it, the way she had learned to stand still through every accusation life had handed her since the fire. Because a woman defending herself too quickly was a woman the crowd decided must have something to defend. It was Temperance Loomis, cane in hand, who broke the silence before Samuel could. "I've known your father 30 years, Adelaide Vane," Temperance said, loud enough to carry to the back row. "And I've known you since you were in short skirts stealing peppermints from my counter. If you've got proof of forgery, take it to a judge. If you've got nothing but a grudge dressed up in fine gloves, sit yourself down and let the rest of us get to our dinners in peace." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd, but Cassia noticed it did not fully clear the air Adelaide had poisoned. Doubt once spoken in a churchyard had a way of lingering in a town's throat long after the laughter faded. Samuel's hand found the brim of his hat and gripped it, the only outward sign Cassia had yet seen of real anger in him. He did not raise his voice. "Adelaide," he said, "you'll bring whatever proof you claim to have to me directly, or you'll stop repeating it in front of people who've no way to judge it fair. That's not a request." Adelaide's composure did not crack, but something behind her eyes recalculated once more the way it had at the mercantile counter. "I only want the truth known, Samuel," she said, "for your sake as much as anyone's." "Then you'll forgive me," Samuel said, "if I don't believe that's the whole of your want." The gathering dispersed slowly, in the particular unhurried way of people who intend to keep discussing something the moment they're out of earshot. And Cassia walked to the wagon beside Samuel without a word, her spine straight, her face arranged into the same careful stillness she'd worn since the fire took everything she'd once let herself be certain of. It was only once they were well down the road, the church steeple small behind them, that her composure allowed itself one crack. "I never sent a letter to any bank," she said, quiet, not quite a question, needing to say it aloud regardless. "I know that," Samuel said without a flicker of doubt in it, and something in the plain certainty of his answer did more to steady her than any defense shouted in a churchyard could have. "She'll keep at it," Cassia said. "Let her," Samuel said. "A lie only holds up long as nobody looks at it close. We'll make sure plenty of people look." Cassia said nothing more the rest of the ride, but she noticed with the same careful attention she gave to a seam that might or might not hold that his hand had found hers on the wagon seat somewhere around the 2nd mile, and that she had not pulled it away. Temperance Loomis rode out that same evening, alerted by whatever quiet channel carried news through Sable Creek faster than any newspaper could have managed, and sat with Cassia at the kitchen table while Samuel saw to the horses. "Adelaide Vane's mother died young," Temperance said without much preamble, "and her father's spent every year since teaching that girl that a Vane's worth is measured in what other people believe about her, not in what she actually does. I don't say that to excuse her. I say it so you know you're not fighting a monster. You're fighting a scared woman who never learned better, same as plenty of us before we did." "That doesn't make the lie less dangerous," Cassia said. "No pas," Temperance agreed. "But it might help you sleep easier tonight knowing the thing chasing you isn't half so large as it wants you to believe it is." Cassia found once Temperance had gone, and the house had settled back into its evening quiet, that it did. The notice arrived by messenger on a Thursday, and Samuel read it twice at the kitchen table before he said a word, which told Cassia everything about how bad it was before he ever spoke. Horace Vane's bank was invoking the annual review clause written into Thaddeus Kincaid's original loan, a clause Samuel explained his father had accepted in a weaker year without reading it as closely as he should have, requiring the bank's satisfaction that the borrower maintained a stable household as a condition of favorable renewal terms. The notice cited in careful lawyer's language recent uncertainty regarding the legitimacy of the current marital arrangement as grounds for a full audit of the loan before any renewal would be granted. "Recent uncertainty," Cassia read aloud, meaning his daughter's churchyard gossip, "meaning exactly that," Samuel said, dressed up so it reads like caution instead of spite. He spread the original loan papers across the table, and Cassia, whose eye for a ledger had been sharpened by years of tracking fabric costs and customer accounts back in Kansas, pulled the pages toward her and read them the way she'd once read a contract from a difficult client, for the words that weren't quite saying what they wanted you to think they said. "This clause doesn't require proof of a genuine marriage," she said, after a while tracing a finger down the relevant paragraph. "It requires proof of a maintained household. Those aren't the same thing, whatever your banker's daughter would like the town to believe. Samuel looked at her with the particular expression she was coming to recognize as his version of being caught off guard in the best way. "You're reading that clearer than my own lawyer did," he said. "I've spent 10 years reading contracts written by people who hoped I wouldn't read them too closely," Cassia said. "This one's no worse than most." They worked past supper that night. The lamp burned low, Cassia's ledger instincts laid alongside Samuel's knowledge of the ranch's accounts, building a plane, accounting of the household, the cabinet he'd built her, the dress orders she'd already begun taking in from 2 neighboring ranches, the running tally of a marriage that had produced in 6 short weeks considerably more evidence of a functioning shared life than a courtroom would likely expect. Somewhere past midnight, with the papers finally squared into an order that felt like a plan rather than a panic, Samuel sat back and looked at her across the table, tired in the way a man gets tired when the day's fight has cost him something real. "I'm sorry you married into this," he said. "Wasn't part of the bargain I offered you in that letter." "Wasn't part of the bargain I answered either," Cassia said. "But I've buried a shop, a sister, and most of what I used to call certain Mr. Kincaid. A banker's daughter with a grudge doesn't scare me half as much as she seems to think it ought to." Something in the plain steel of that answer settled over the table between them, quiet and real, and Samuel reached across it, not for the papers, but for her hand, resting it there without pulling her closer, without asking for more than the simple fact of it. "I keep learning there's more to this bargain than I paid for," he said. "My mother used to say a good marriage was just 2 ledgers learning to balance each other," Cassia said, quiet the memory surfacing before she'd decided to share it. "I didn't understand what she meant until tonight, watching you read your father's contract like it might still be fair to you if you looked at it patient enough." "What happened to her, your mother?" Samuel asked, careful the way he asked most things that mattered. "Passed before the fire. I've been grateful for that some nights, and ashamed of being grateful other nights," Cassia admitted. "She didn't have to lose the shop and Naomi both in the same year. Small mercy, maybe, but I've learned to take the small ones where the world hands them out." "That's no small mercy," Samuel said. "That's just mercy. Small isn't a size grief comes in far as I've ever seen." Cassia let her hand stay under his and did not trust herself yet to say what she was beginning, carefully and against her own better judgment, to feel. The barn fire started small, an overturned lantern in the tack room, caught early enough by one of the hands that it never grew past a corner of scorched wood and one ruined saddle blanket. By any sober accounting, it was nothing, a scare quickly handled over within 20 minutes. Cassia did not experience it as nothing. She reached the barn at a run behind Samuel, and the moment the smell hit her, that particular scorch of green wood and old leather, her body simply stopped answering to her the way it had once stopped answering to her in the doorway of a burning dress shop with her sister. Somewhere inside it, she never reached in time. Her hands, which had steadied a panicked heifer without a tremor, shook now uselessly at her sides. She stood in the yard, unable to move toward the water buckets. The hands were already passing hand to hand, unable to do anything but stand very still and breathe air that her body insisted wrongly and completely was killing her. It was Samuel, once the fire was out and the danger fully past, who found her still standing there a full 10 minutes later, staring at nothing. He did not ask her what was wrong. He seemed somehow to already understand that words would be the wrong tool for whatever this was. He simply sat down on the porch step beside her, close enough that his shoulder rested against hers, and stayed there in silence, while the hands finished checking the barn for embers and the night settled back into its ordinary sounds. "Naomi," Cassia said finally into the dark, the name arriving before she'd decided to let it. "My sister. She went back in for the ledger book. I told her the ledger didn't matter. She went back anyway." Samuel said nothing, which was, she understood now, exactly the right thing to say. I've told people it was a fire that took the shop. Cassia went on, her voice steadier than she expected it to be, now that the words had finally found their way out after a year of staying locked behind her teeth. I don't tell people it was a fire that took her too, because once you say that out loud, people start looking at you like you're made of something breakable. I got so tired of being looked at that way, so I stopped saying it at all. You're not looking broken to me, Samuel said quietly. You're looking like a woman who's been carrying something heavy a long way by herself. Those aren't the same thing, whatever it might feel like some nights. Cassia turned to look at him properly, then the porch lamp throwing just enough light to see that he meant it plainly, without the pity she'd spent a year flinching away from in other faces. I keep waiting for you to decide I'm more trouble than the bargain was worth, she said. The fire, the rumors, whatever Adelaide Vane digs up next. I keep waiting for the morning you tell me the letter I wrote made promises my life can't keep. Samuel was quiet a moment, watching the last of the smoke thin against the stars. I buried my father owing more than this ranch was worth some years, and my mother before him, and I've yet to find the bottom of what a person can carry and still get up in the morning, he said. I'm not asking you to be easy, Cassia. I'm asking you to hear. Those aren't the same bargain either. She did not answer that in words. She let her head rest finally against his shoulder, and he did not move away from the weight of it. And they sat there together on the step until the smoke smell faded from the air, and something in her chest, some knot, pulled tight, since a Kansas Christmas, a year gone, loosened by another careful degree. She woke the next morning to the smell of coffee already made and found Samuel at the stove, an apron tied crooked over his work shirt, attempting eggs with the particular concentration of a man who had clearly never once in his life attempted eggs. You didn't need to do this, Cassia said, echoing without meaning to the same words she'd given him over the sewing cabinet weeks before. Didn't need to, Samuel agreed, sliding a plate toward her that looked considerably worse than it tasted. Figured you'd earned a morning where somebody else did the carrying. She ate his badly cooked eggs at the kitchen table in the gray early light and found that they tasted somehow like exactly the thing she'd needed, though she could not have named it as anything so plain as eggs if anyone had asked her to. The week that followed brought word through Temperance Loomis's ever-reliable channels that Horace Vane intended to bring the matter before a full town meeting rather than settle it quietly through the bank's usual paperwork. A public airing meant, Samuel said grimly, to shame them into forfeiting the loan's renewal rather than fight it on the actual terms of the clause. Cassia took the news, the way she took most bad news now, with a stillness that gave little away, and spent the better part of the afternoon at her cabinet, hands moving through mending. She barely saw her mind circling back again and again to a year-old habit of counting up everything she had ever loved and lost it to. The shop, Naomi. Now perhaps a home she had only just begun letting herself trust. A letter had come that same post from her father back in Kansas. A few careful lines asking after her health and offering no burden of advice, and she had read it twice without being able to say afterward what it contained her attention, too thoroughly occupied by the sound of a whole town preparing to judge her marriage a lie. By evening, the stillness had thinned to something closer to its true shape, and that night, alone in her room with a stack of mending, she wasn't really seeing it finally broke. She found Samuel on the porch, checking the latch on the barn door out of habit more than necessity, and she stood beside him in the cold, with her arms wrapped around herself, the words arriving before she'd fully decided to let them. I think you chose the wrong bride, she said, quiet, almost too quiet to carry the short distance between them. A plainer woman, one without a burned shop and a dead sister and a stranger's grudge following her out from Kansas. I keep bringing you trouble. I never meant to bring Samuel. I keep thinking the honest thing would have been to stay gone and let you find a wife this town didn't already have a reason to doubt. She said it the way she'd said very little else in her life, without armor, without the careful stillness she'd worn like a second skin since the fire. The whole raw shape of a year's grief and fear laid bare in the cold night air between them. Samuel did not answer her with words at first. He simply reached over and took her hand the way he had at the kitchen table weeks before. Except this time he did not let go after a moment. He held it plain and steady until she stopped shaking, and only then did he speak. I chose a woman who stitched a heifer's leg closed with a sewing needle because she wouldn't let an animal suffer for want of the right tool, he said. I chose a woman who read a bank's contract clearer than my own lawyer inside one evening. I chose a woman who sat in a churchyard and let a coward's lie roll off her, rather than give the crowd the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Cassia. I did not marry a plain woman by mistake and get handed you instead. I got exactly the bargain I didn't know I needed, and I mean to keep it, trouble and all. The trouble's not finished, Cassia said, her voice breaking on the last word, despite everything. No, Samuel agreed, but neither am I. He did not pull her into an embrace, did not make a show of comfort for its own sake. He simply kept holding her hand out there in the cold until her breathing steadied and the shaking stopped, the same patient stillness he'd offered her on the porch step after the barn fire. The same silent answer he seemed to reach for whenever words would only get in the way of what needed saying. I'm frightened. Cassia admitted the words, costing her something to say, plainly after a year of refusing to say them at all. I know, Samuel said. Frightened's allowed. Just don't go thinking frightened and wrong are the same word. You've been reading contracts wrong your whole life if you believe that one. Something in her chest gave way at that, not into tears exactly, but into a kind of quiet that felt for the first time since Kansas less like grief and more like rest. She stood there in the cold with her hand in his and understood without needing to say it aloud just yet that whatever the town meeting brought, she no longer intended to face it as a stranger passing through Samuel Kincaid's life. She intended to face it as his wife in every sense the word had quietly grown to mean. The meeting was held in the schoolhouse, the only room in Sable Creek large enough to hold the crowd that turned out drawn as much by curiosity as by any real stake in the Kincaid loan. Horace Vane opened proceedings with the careful, regretful tone of a man who wanted the room to believe he took no pleasure in what he was about to do, laying out the renewal clause and the bank's stated concerns regarding the legitimacy of the household in plain procedural language designed to sound like caution rather than attack. Cassia sat beside Samuel in the front row, spine straight, hands folded, and did not look away once while Horace spoke, which she noted with some private satisfaction seemed to unsettle him considerably more than tears would have. It was Samuel who rose first when Horace finished, and he did not raise his voice because he had learned these last weeks that the loudest man in a room was rarely the one people remembered as telling the truth. I'll answer the bank's concern plain, he said, since plain seems to be in short supply in this whole business. I married Cassia Truett by letter and license, same as my father, and half the men in this room married their own wives one way or another. Since she arrived, she's kept this household's books straighter than I ever did, alone closed a wound on a suffering animal with her own 2 hands, and sat through a churchyard accusation without once returning the ugliness she was handed. If the bank wants proof of a stable household, I've brought it. He set the ranch ledger down on the schoolhouse desk, Cassia's careful handwriting filling half its recent pages. Every entry in the last 6 weeks is hers. Read it yourselves. A murmur moved through the room, and Horace Vane, sensing the ground shifting under a case built more on his daughter's grudge than any real evidence, opened his mouth to object, but it was Adelaide herself, unexpectedly, who spoke next, rising from her seat near the back, with a stiffness that suggested the words cost her considerably more than her usual practiced ease. I never had proof of forgery, Adelaide said into a silence that had gone suddenly completely still. I had a resemblance in penmanship and a wish that things had gone differently for me. I let that wish do more talking than the truth ever did, and I'm not proud of the shape it's taken since. She did not look at Samuel while she said it. She looked instead at Cassia, and something passed between the two women that was not quite apology and not quite peace, but was perhaps the beginning of both. Cassia rose then and spoke for herself in the plain voice she had spent a year believing the world no longer wanted to hear from her. I lost a shop and a sister to a fire in Kansas, she said to a room that had until that morning known her only as a rumor's target. I came out here to build something honest with what was left of me. I never asked this town to hand me trust for free. I only ask it judge me by what I've actually done since I arrived, same as it would judge anyone else. Horace Vane sat through his daughter's admission with the stiff, reddening stillness of a man watching a carefully built case collapse in front of a room full of witnesses, and when he finally rose to speak, his voice had lost the smooth, procedural calm it opened with. This bank has every right to satisfy itself of a stable household before renewing, he began. The room's mood had already shifted past him, and Temperance Loomis's dry voice cut through from the back row before he could finish. You've had your household proof read out loud, Horace, she said. Ledger in her own hand half this town's testimony, and your own daughter walking back her word in front of God and everybody. Man who can't take yes for an answer when he's been handed one ought to ask himself what he was really after in the first place. The laughter that followed was not unkind, but it was final, and Horace Vane sat back down with the particular defeat of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that his daughter's grudge had cost him more standing in one evening than a year of careful banking had built. The vote, the bank's own charter required in cases of contested renewal, was called that same evening, a formality Horace Vane had clearly not expected to need, and it went decisively and without much further debate in the Kincaids' favor. The loan renewed on its original terms, the clause satisfied beyond any reasonable question the bank could still raise. Outside the schoolhouse, the crowd lingered longer than usual, the way a town does when it has just watched something settled that it half expected to stay unsettled. Temperance Loomis caught Cassia's arm before she reached the wagon, her sharp face softened for once into something like open approval. I've seen this town try to run good people out on less than what you were handed, she said, and I've seen precious few stand and answer it plain the way you did tonight. You'll do fine here, Cassia Kincaid. I'd stake my own name on it now, and I don't stake that lightly. Two of Samuel's hands, Otis and young Wren, tipped their hats to her on the way past, murmuring a respect they'd withheld, careful and earned, since her first week on the ranch, and Cassia found she had to look away for a moment to keep her composure whole. Walking out of the schoolhouse into the cold night air, Samuel found Cassia's hand without needing to look for it, the gesture worn smooth now by weeks of practice, and neither of them said much on the ride home. There was, for the first time since the letter that started this whole arrangement, very little left that needed defending. Winter came early to Sable Creek that year, the first hard frost arriving before the last of the harvest was fully in. And Cassia Kincaid met it from inside a house that had by slow and careful degrees stopped feeling like a stranger's roof over her head. She spent the first cold evening of the season doing what she always did when her hands wanted occupying and her heart wanted settling. She mended something. This time it was the same faded curtain she had patched hastily. Her first week in the house, a makeshift job done with whatever thread had been closest to hand. She unpicked her old stitches by lamplight and set them right properly. Small, and even the way her mother had taught her before she could read the way she had once believed she'd never feel steady enough to do again. Samuel found her there near midnight. The curtain finished and folded neat across her lap, and he sat down beside her. Without a word, the way he had learned these past months was often the truest thing he could offer. Adelaide came by the mercantile today, Cassia said. Asked after the ranch civil as anything. I think she meant it. Grudges cost more to keep than they're worth once the fight's actually lost, Samuel said. I expect she's learning that same as her father is. Cassia held the curtain up between them, checking the line of the new stitches against the lamplight. This was the first thing I fixed in this house, she said. Badly, if I'm honest. I didn't trust myself to do more than a stopgap job that first week. Didn't trust much of anything that first week, if we're being plain about it. And now, Samuel asked. Now I trust it to hold, Cassia said, and did not mean only the curtain. Earlier that week, she had finally written her father a proper letter, longer than the careful, guarded notes she'd sent since arriving, telling him plainly about the bank, the churchyard, and the man she had married, for reasons that had started out practical and become somewhere along the way considerably less so. She told him too about Naomi, that she had started saying her sister's name out loud again, to Samuel, to Temperance, to the quiet of her own room at night, and that saying it no longer felt like reopening a wound so much as tending one that had finally begun carefully to close. She had kept one line of her mother's stitching pattern worked into the corner of the curtain, now hanging clean, and even in the window. A small, unspoken marker that some things carried forward were meant to be carried, not buried. They hung it together, an ordinary task made unhurried by the late hour and the empty house around them, Samuel holding the rod steady, while Cassia set the folds right. And when it was done, they stood back and looked at it in silence, the same easy quiet that had grown week over week into the truest language between them. I think you chose the wrong bride once, Cassia said, finally echoing her own words from weeks before, though. There was no fear left in them now. Only something warmer, something closer to wonder at how far the ground had shifted beneath a sentence that had once cost her so much to say. I've told you before, Samuel said, taking her hand the way he always did, now plain and unhurried, needing no more ceremony than that. Wrong bride was never the truth of it. Just took us both some weeks to read the contract right. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun to fall over the Kincaid Ranch, quiet and steady, settling over fences that held, and a loan that was no longer in question, and a marriage that had started as paper and become by slow and careful degrees entirely real. Cassia stood at the window a moment longer than she needed to, watching it come down, and found that for the first time since a Kansas Christmas, she could not quite stop thinking about she was not bracing herself against what the winter might take. She was only watching it fall steady and unafraid, beside a man who had never once from the very first letter made her feel like anything less than exactly the bride he meant to choose.
That's the whole of it. A woman who came west carrying more grief than luggage, and a man who never once needed her to be anything other than exactly who she was to call the bargain worth keeping. It was never really about a bank, or a rumor, or a rancher's deadline. It was about two people learning slowly and without much ceremony. That's the right kind of love doesn't announce itself with grand speeches. Sometimes it just reaches for your hand in the dark and hold on. If you make it this far, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Rub your city and stay below. I read every one of them. If this story found you at the right moment, read it a like and consider subscribing. There's another story waiting for you soon, and the fire's not going anywhere.